Good day, dear students. Today, our lecture about philosophy of history. My name is Khmelnytskaya Olesya Mikhailовna, discipline philosophy for students all specialties. And you can see, please, you can see lecture plan. The first is the formation of the philosophy of history, online progressive development of concept, multi-line progressive development of concept, and cyclical development concept. Cyclical. And let's start our lecture.
This is a video about the philosophy of history. Now, if you know much about philosophy, you probably know the main branches of philosophy. Metaphysics, which is the study of reality. Epistemology, which is the question of truth and knowledge. How do I know that I know what I think I know? Ethics, which is the study of, what is the good life? What does it mean to have a good life? How am I supposed to live in this world? What should I do? What shouldn't I do? But there are also a number of domains in philosophy that are the philosophy of various things. Philosophy asks questions about everything, about every aspect of life. And so there is a philosophy of religion, which asks questions about what people do when they're doing religion. So, and questions like, is there a God? Arguments for the existence of God. Questions like, why is there evil in the world if God is a God of love? Those are questions that the philosophy of religion studies. There's philosophy of art. Philosophy of art asks questions like, what makes something art? What's the difference between something I scribble on a napkin and something Picasso scribbled on a napkin? Is there bad art, or is beauty in the eye of the beholder? This particular video is about the philosophy of history. Philosophy of history asks questions like, well, what is history? Is history going somewhere? What is it that historians are really doing when they do history? What should they do when they do history? So this is a video about the philosophy of history. Now, Herodotus has sometimes been called the father of history. Obviously, the Chinese aren't going to call Herodotus the father of history. And so we immediately, again, get into here when we're talking about Herodotus as the father of history, we get into the philosophy of history. Well, why do some people call him the father of history? Well, the person who called him the father of history was a Roman named Cicero. Cicero lived in the 1st century BC. Herodotus was a Greek who lived in the 400s BC. Why did Cicero call him the father of history? Well, for one thing, Herodotus is a Greek and Cicero is a Roman. Why would Cicero consider Herodotus part of his history? Or did he? I think he did. And this made sense because the Romans had conquered the Greeks militarily. I can't remember who it was, a Roman, who said that the Romans may have conquered the Greeks militarily, but the Greeks conquered the Romans culturally, because the Romans then absorbed the Greek culture from the Greeks. But obviously a Chinese person or a person from India or a person from Africa is going to be less likely to consider Herodotus to be the father of history for them. But did Cicero was there some truth to what Cicero was saying? Well, Cicero called him the father of history because he thought that Herodotus stuck more to what actually happened, rather than writing poetry that's pleasurable about the gods. So Cicero thought that Homer, talking about Achilles and Trojans and Agamemnon and all those people and horses, he considered that to be more fanciful, more legendary. He didn't consider that to be history. And of course, Herodotus was writing about the Persian Wars, which had happened within his lifetime. You may have seen the movie The 300. And so Herodotus was writing about the recent past. And so it had a more real flavor to it than writing about something that allegedly happened, 500, 600 years, 700 years ago. And so this is why Cicero thought that Herodotus was writing more history than poetry for pleasure, because he was writing about things that had actually happened rather than fanciful things from the past. Of course, Plutarch, even at that time, Plutarch, writing in the first century AD, called Herodotus the father of lies rather than the father of history. Um, well, let's ask what really was, if anything, unique or different about Herodotus as opposed to the people that came before him. Well, for one thing, Herodotus did not just privilege the Greeks. He did not just privilege his own people or the perspectives of his own people when he wrote. This is probably why Plutarch didn't like him. Plutarch felt like Herodotus gave too much credit to non-Greeks, and this probably means that Plutarch was a bad historian. Actually, I would say that Plutarch is rather fanciful in his reconstructions of the lives of ancients and so forth. He's not he's not unbiased. The historian tries to be unbiased. The historian tries to take into the points of view of not just the position you like the most, but also the position of the other people. And so one of the reasons why Herodotus is probably a little different from even books like First and Second Kings. First and Second Kings privilege the perspective of Israel, and not just all Israelites, but the perspective of southern Judah. Certainly, somebody from the northern kingdom would not have written First Kings the way First Kings is written. I mean, if you look at First Kings, there are no kings from the north who are good kings. All the kings from the north are bad kings in First Kings. And so, in that sense, First Kings is not written in a way that brings in the perspectives of the northern kingdom or the perspectives of the Assyrians in Second Kings or the perspectives of the Egyptians and so forth. And so the fact that Herodotus took into account the perspectives of not just the Greeks but other peoples was different about his telling of history. As I mentioned, he was writing about more recent events rather than the distant past. I mean, we have access to archaeology and a lot of things that someone like Herodotus would not have had access to. And so it makes sense that if you're writing about recent events, it's going to have a more, shall we say, historical dimension to it than when an ancient person is writing about the distant past. It just when you're writing about the distant past, it's especially in that day and age, it's just natural that it's going to become more legendary and fanciful as you go back into the things that you just don't have direct access to. Herodotus sought out primary sources. When you seek out a primary source, you're getting it from the horse's mouth. You're not getting it from the cat telling you what the horse said. You're getting it from the horse itself. The more layers there are between you and the source, the more likely it is that it's been skewed by some perspective. If you can actually go and talk to the person, and this can happen, of course, when you hear a rumor. You may jump on a rumor because you like it, because it makes somebody you don't like look bad. But if you really want the truth, you need to seek out the real people who are involved with it. Get it straight from the people who are involved with it, the primary sources. That's good history investigation, as opposed to simply believing whichever source makes the most. This happened, for example, to Dan Rather, who was a newscaster several years ago, who's kind of disappeared from the scene now. But there was a forged document about President George Bush Jr. and that's not his name, but anyway, the younger George Bush. And Dan Rather was just sure that this document was true because it fit into what he, believed about the character of that president. It turned out it was a forgery, and he lost his job. But this idea of not trusting secondary sources, but going straight to the horse's mouth, getting the real scoop, the eyewitness account, seeking out primary sources, that's good history writing. And of course, for the most part, Herodotus used normal cause and effect descriptions. It's true. The crumbs that I'm seeing on the counter might have been a demon, that invaded my kitchen and my cookie drawer, and the demon really munched down or an angel, on the cookie. I mean, that may be what happened, especially since I believe in angels and demons. But what is the most natural explanation of those cookie crumbs? Well, the most natural explanation is that somebody in my house, somebody who I know to have been in the house in the time between the cookies being put in the drawer and the crumbs being on the table, somebody in the house ate it. This is normal historical kind of thinking, and Herodotus uses it rather than using gods as a kind of a at the last minute Superman comes in and rescues the day. Using normal cause and effect reasoning is generally better history writing than bringing in other explanations that you aren't sure about. For example, conspiracy theories. If you think about it, the idea of a conspiracy theory is that things aren't the way they appear, but that something sinister is going on behind the scenes. Well, think about it. If the definition of a conspiracy theory is that things aren't as they appear, then by the very nature of what a conspiracy theory is, it is less likely to be true because things as they appear is the normal way of reconstructing events. And so conspiracy theories, by their very nature, are less likely to be true than the what you see is what you get approach to history writing. Well, I may have spent too much time on Herodotus, but there are reasons to consider Herodotus to be distinctive within the flow of history telling in the ancient world. And the features I've just mentioned are some of them. But it really hasn't been till modern times. Leopold von Ranke lived in the early 1800s um, until we really begin to refine historical method in the ways that we've just been talking about. So von Ranke suggested three criteria for good history writing. First of all, tell it like it happened. This approach to history telling is sometimes called historicism, where you try to tell it exactly how it happened. Now, I would say that it is pretty much agreed by all historians today that you can't do this, that all history writing involves interpretation. You have to decide which events are significant and which events aren't significant. And this kind of selection, deselection, and interpretation of causes and effects inevitably brings subjectivity into history telling. Now, I'm not suggesting that there aren't more and less objective tellings of history. I think there are. There are tellings of history that are clearly off the wall in their subjectivity, and there are clearly more objective tellings. The key to objectivity is that you're willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads. If you're not willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, then you're not objective. If you're not willing to describe the evidence as it seems to be, then you are not a good historian. You are somebody who should not be trusted, in fact, because you are not oriented around the real world. You're oriented around ideas that may or may not be true. And so the idea of objective is that I'm willing to evaluate the evidence as it actually is, regardless of what I want the evidence to say. Um, and part of this is to question your sources. So one of the things that von Ranke criticized about history telling in his day is that people tended to just believe certain sources because they liked them, and they didn't realize that the sources that they were using had a perspective too. This is true with, for example, the Jewish historian Josephus. When you're reading Josephus's account of the first century, you have to take into account the fact that he had a perspective. Here's a guy who defected or surrendered to the Romans in the Jewish War of the late 60s. And so he wants to defend himself as having done the right thing. Somebody writing another version might say, you were a coward, Josephus. You were a traitor. Somebody else might write that way. Josephus obviously is not going to present himself as a traitor, and he's writing for the Romans. So he's obviously not going to critique the Romans that much. So von Ranke suggested that when you're reconstructing history, you need to take into account the bias of your sources. This last bit of von Ranke, and I put it in my own words, but I think this is very important because we often have a tendency to organize history according to our ideas rather than letting the data of history itself tell us what the categories are. So, this is even calling the Middle Ages the Middle Ages is an example of this. Why are they called the Middle Ages? I mean, nobody living in the Middle Ages said, well, it's the Middle Ages and we're here in, ancient France in the Middle Ages. Nobody said that. The very idea of the Middle Ages is an imposition on a period of history done by later people. done by people who didn't consider the Middle Ages so intelligent. In fact, other people called it the Dark Ages. Now, there's a value judgment, an idea imposed upon hundreds and hundreds of years. And of course, since most of us in my circles are Protestants, we kind of find that very comfortable because we don't mind calling the Catholic period the dark period and so forth. But this idea that the Renaissance, the rebirth, as if there was no culture prior to the 14 and 1500s, uh, these are value judgments. This is organizing history by ideological systems rather than letting the data of history generate its own categories. Um, Francois Lyotard was the one who coined the first, or coined the word postmodernism. And he described postmodernism as a strong resistance to what he called grand récits, or large stories. And the idea here is that the more that you try to create large ideological systems out of data, whether it be history or whether it be reality, the more you try to organize the infinite and diverse data of history into large, what are called topologies or systems of thought, the more likely you are to skew that individual bits of data. And so when we are on the most firm basis when we're describing events that are local and a particular time and place, because then we're looking at what I call the petit récit, the small story. But the more that we try to organize history into large ideological systems, the more likely it is that we're skewing a lot of stuff. And von Ranke was reacting here to a philosopher named Hegel. Hegel had divided all of history into this evolution of things against things and synthesizing, and then things against things. Um, Basically dividing up history into the flow of ideas versus ideas. Beware of large ideological systems when it comes to history, because they are, by their very nature, likely to skew things. I mean, even to say right now we live in a postmodern age. What are you exactly saying? There are a lot of people who aren't postmodern. There are a lot of people who are as anti-postmodern as ever right now. And so, by labeling even a decade as a certain thing, you're immediately running the risk of skewing a whole lot of stuff that happened in a decade. Well, okay. Ernst Troeltsch wrote in the early 1900s. He had three criteria as well. Um, he said, first of all, that history is revisable, that we get new data, and so we need to always be willing to revise previous understandings of history in the light of new evidence. The new perspectives on evidence can arise that haven't been thought of before, and sometimes that moves us along. I think that we are in we live after so many thinkers have thought so many things that we can come across way smarter than all these people who've lived for thousands of years. Not because we are smarter than them, we're not any smarter than the people of the past, but we have so much more to draw on in our understanding than they did. We should be able to come up with more coherent and corresponding hypotheses than ever before, because we've had so many people take a shot at it up till now. We can pick the best ones. Now, this second principle of Troeltsch is a little bit problematic from a Christian perspective, and this is his principle of analogy. He basically said, if you don't see it happening now, it couldn't have happened back then. If people don't live to be 965 years today, then they couldn't have lived to be 965 years in Methuselah's day. You know, this is his reflects what we might call his anti-supernaturalist bias. What he's saying is that we don't have Athena dropping in for lunch today, and therefore Athena didn't drop in for lunch, 3,000 years ago. Now, of course, Christians generally do believe that God intervenes in history today. Christians believe in miracles. Christians believe in the supernatural. And I've known Christians from the third world who've witnessed resurrections. So Troeltsch would say, well, resurrections don't happen today, and therefore Jesus couldn't have been risen from the dead back then. I'm not sure that that really is a valid claim at all. But in general, we get what he's saying. Even if I don't go with it completely, there is a sense that there is a kind of normal operating of the world, a kind of a principle of cause and effect. That if you see something happen, you look for a cause that fits that. And so the question we have as Christians is, when do we say a miracle happened here? I think normally when we look back in history, we should again. I think it makes sense to say, what's the cause and effect of what's happening, 500 years ago, and think of it similarly to the way cause and effect happens today. But when we've exhausted, well, I can't really explain this on the basis of cause and effect. I'm going to say a miracle happened here. This is I think, a valid Christian way of thinking. But these were Troeltsch's principles, and Troeltsch again was anti-supernatural, so he basically used these principles to say that you can't believe in miracles in the Gospel of Mark because he didn't believe miracles happen today. Of course, I think most Christians believe that miracles do happen today. Okay, well, some of the pushback on the historicism of von Ranke. One is, as I've already mentioned, that all history telling involves selection and interpretation. And this implies that there is no such thing as completely objective history telling. All history telling is subjective to some extent. But that doesn't mean that we can't try. We should try. There is history telling that's completely subjective, and hopefully we develop a skill for smelling out completely one-sided tellings of history. Um, this is a great quote by Orwell. He who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future. That's from 1984, or George Orwell's famous book. It fits with Michel Foucault's idea that power has an awful lot to do with the way you tell history. History is told by the winners. You might have heard that expression. The idea here is that if I can control the story, then I can control how you behave going forward. So as I record this video, we're in the middle of a government shutdown, and we may be headed for a default on our budgetary obligations in the next few days. I hope it doesn't happen. But the way that we tell the events will, there is a fight right now for who controls what has happened here. Is the narrative this, that Congress came to a point where it was supposed to increase the debt limit, as it has done often in the past, but it decided to co-opt this opportunity to try to defund the Health Care Act that President Obama had passed, and so they stubbornly won't give in to do what they need to do until they get their way. Is that the way we tell the story, or do we tell it this way, that the president is a dictator who has forced healthcare reform on the American people who don't want it, and the Congress decided to take one last stand, and the president isn't willing to compromise on it. If they would just compromise a little, they would pass these laws. I mean, who controls the story of what's happening? And of course, some people watch their news channel to get the one version, and other people watch the other news channel to get the other version. Orwell's basically saying is whoever can control the telling of the story can control what it looks like going forward. And history is told by the winners because the winners control the story. So when we talk about Hitler's a bad guy. I think he was a bad guy. I mean, I really think that's objective, pretty objective that Hitler was a bad guy. But I guarantee you that if the Nazis had won, that history would have been told much differently than it's told now. A lot of Russians grew up hearing that Russia had been the first on the moon, as I recall. So at least I've heard that, but I haven't heard the primary sources. So maybe that's me just believing what I want to believe. Another thing here is that Clifford Geertz is a famous sociologist and anthropologist who suggested that telling history is not just or talking about a culture. He was not so much a historian, but talking about a culture is not so much about talking about just actions. So like take the biblical command to greet the brothers with a, or that's not really a command, but the instruction to greet the brothers with a holy kiss. If I go to my church and I greet a guy with a kiss, it's not going to mean the same thing as what that action meant in the first century. We can do exactly what they did in Bible times and not be doing what they did because the sociocultural matrix in which that action is defined is different. I would say that even saying that the husband is the head of the home or that the wife needs to submit to her husband, I think that has a vastly different connotation in 21st century America than it had in first century Greco-Roman culture. And so this idea of describing history not just in terms of who, what, where, when, but in terms of what the significance of actions were back then is essential to a real thick understanding of history. So what is the significance of money? There are a lot of organizations that want to give you a biblical view of money, but a lot of those organizations have no idea how differently money has a connotation in an agrarian society of the Bible and the connotations of money in a monetary economy such as we have. Or even what is a person? We're individualists. And so we read the Bible as individualists without even realizing that the people who wrote these and read these texts were not individualists. They were group-oriented people. Telling history involves not just inserting our cultural assumptions into the past, but interpreting history in terms of the cultural assumptions of the people we're writing about, and what were their intentions in their time and place. Of course, we don't really have access to a person's intentions. We only have access to what they say and how it manifests itself. Okay, we're getting close to the end here, I hope. There are various approaches to history. There are cyclical views, there are linear views of history. I would say the default view of human beings is cyclical. Everything repeats itself, history repeats itself. The linear view really comes into play with the rise of Jewish apocalyptic in the centuries right before Christ. Here we begin to stretch out all of history into a series of events, starting usually with a beautiful past and usually degenerating down into the present. And then there's usually a kind of a God moment where God comes in, cleans things up, and then everything is good to go on. That, of course, in Jewish apocalyptic was never understood in terms of absolute eternity. In Jewish apocalyptic writing, apocalyptic is like the book of Revelation. That was just the end of the age, and then a new age began. They didn't think in terms of timeless eternity by and large. But Christianity, especially St. Augustine's The City of God, writing the 400s, begins to think of of history in a much more linear fashion. So for Augustine, there's the city of God and there's the city of man, and these two are to some extent in conflict with each other. But he saw the city of God increasing and the city of man disappearing. Of course, Augustine lived through the sacking of Rome, which had to have been a cataclysmic thing. How can barbarians invade Rome? Kind of like the way Americans felt on 9/11. How can a terrorist come to America? I mean, that just was unheard of, unthought of, that somebody would actually reach our soils. Not since the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor had something like that happened. It certainly wasn't something I'd ever experienced. And so Augustine had this philosophy of history that basically saw the city of God growing and growing and growing, and the city of man decreasing and decreasing and decreasing and decreasing. We see this in the church today. There are a lot of Christians who have what we might call a premillennial view of history. And this is the idea that things are just going to get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And when we're about to just blow up the whole world, God will come in and rescue us all. That's probably not the dominant view that Christians have had throughout history. Probably most Christians throughout history have had more of a post-millennial view that saw things as getting better and better and better and better and better and better and better. The kingdom of God, arrives. And these are assumptions that we may not even realize we have. Do we have an assumption that things are just going to get worse and worse and worse and worse? Or do we have an assumption that things are going to get better and better and better and better? Neither one of them is an exclusively Christian view. There are Christians who've held both of them. And so again, Philosophy is about knowing yourself, becoming aware of your own assumptions. I'm going to talk briefly about myths of progress. So, especially in the last 150 years or so, from time to time, we've told ourselves a myth of progress. Progress is inevitable. Things are going to get better and better and better. This went along with evolution in the late 1800s, and of course, World War One kind of dashed it to pieces. Then World War Two and the Great Depression kind of dashed it to pieces. But I would say that around the year 2000, I was very much feeling that progress zeitgeist or spirit of the age. Then 9/11 came, and I think for the last, over 10 years since 9/11, America has been in a kind of apocalyptic mindset. Things are getting worse, but it's the end of the world. And that has affected the way, for example, college students today see the world, and in ways that I don't think are all positive. But that's kind of where we're at. But there have been myths of progress. The myth of communism that Karl Marx spun out in the 1800s. Again, he imposed this ideological system on history. He saw history as this thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So you have the slaves versus the kings, and then the synthesis is merchants versus rulers, and then you have the bourgeois versus the proletariat. And so he took the incredibly complex data of history. I mean, good grief, how preposterous is this ideological system of Karl Marx? He imposed upon the very diverse data of history this very simplistic theory about how history has developed and evolved. He believed eventually we would live in a communist society where nobody had any possessions of their own. History hasn't, by the way, vindicated his theory. But even the idea of Western civilization was invented to kind of say there's this thread of civilized people, and everybody else is stupid, but this idea that it started in Sumer, and then it went to Babylon, and then to the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and eventually to the Greeks, and then the Romans, and now we're in Europe. This myth of progress of Western civilization basically said everybody who's been smart is in my lineage, is in my past, and it's led up till today. And of course, American exceptionalism is part of that story of progress. The idea that Americans are better than everybody else because we stand at the pinnacle of this evolutionary process of civilization. Well, what is a Christian to think? And I just want to end this video presentation with what a Christian view of history might be. Well, Christians take, by the way, you can do this even with the Bible. The Bible is 66 individual books, and a lot of the stories in the Bible didn't originally connect to each other. But we as
sounds simple. The history of philosophy and the philosophy of history are different topics. Simply, the history of philosophy is the study of what particular philosophers in the past thought or argued, whereas philosophy of history is a discipline which asks questions about our practice of documenting and drawing meaning from history itself. History of philosophy is something that might be practiced by people who weren't philosophers, just in documenting the lives of different philosophers and some of their ideas. Whereas philosophy of history is something that's very much within the discipline of philosophy. Though history of philosophy is important for doing philosophy. So, the history of philosophy is the documentation of arguments from particular philosophers and their influence on future thoughts and ideas. Since philosophy is often in dialogue with previous ideas or arguments, understanding the historical background for an argument is often essential to understanding that argument. This can mean that learning that the scholastic philosophers were attempting to reconcile the works of Aristotle and the Bible in order to better understand their metaphysical worldview. So if you want to understand the claims and arguments that St. Thomas Aquinas is making, completely separate from gaining an understanding of Aristotle and Aristotle's metaphysics, you're not going to do a good job. But it's also about learning that Epicurus was sick and in pain much of his life, to understand his philosophy of pleasure in this kind of traditional Epicurean view, not so much as one of indulgence, like we might actually claim of Cyrenaicism, but rather one of freedom from pain, because he was so sickly and so much in pain for so much of his life. So, history of philosophy can help inform the philosophical arguments that we make in our interpretations of arguments and positions that are even held today. Philosophy of history does something different. So, philosophy of history asks questions like, does history consist of maybe periods, individual actions, civilizations, or something else? What does history really consist of? When we're studying history, what really are we studying? Are we studying people? Are we studying things that were done? Are we studying collections of people and cultures? What should we study? It asks the question, does history have a direction or an end goal? Does history make progress? Have we, over the past thousands of years, made progress in some way? Have we gone backwards? And what should we measure that progress by? Economists may tell you GDP, but philosophy asks the question, what should we measure that progress by? It asks questions of how can we know about history? Is history only written by the victors, as it might be? How can we really know what happened in a certain period of time from an epistemic standpoint? What counts as justification for facts in the distant past? Are we allowed to have weaker justification for facts that are temporally distant from us than for those that are happening right now? Now, we've not covered much of philosophy of history on this channel. And generally, it's much more common in the continental tradition than the analytic one. And I'm steeped in the analytic tradition and would love to expand to more continental philosophers and more Eastern philosophers one day, when I run out of things to do on analytic philosophy, perhaps. And hopefully sooner than that, in all honesty. But Hegel did write a great deal on the subject, and he's one of the central philosophers in the philosophy of history. However, if you're interested in the philosophy of history, I would caution with starting with Hegel unless you have a strong grasp of philosophy and a good sense of yourself in terms of reading very complex texts. Hegel is famously, notoriously difficult to comprehend. I would recommend maybe starting with a secondary source that talks about some of Hegel's ideas first, and then accompanying that with the Hegel. But all of that to say, philosophy of history is very different from history of philosophy. Videos that, like our series on the...
And now, if you understand this video, you must answer the question for self-control. If you don't understand, you may saw video again, or you maybe you read this literature. This literature help you for this theme about seminar lessons and self-control lesson of your CSP. And if you all understand, it's very good because it's very interesting theme. And if you don't know anything, you may watch this content on YouTube or another platform. And now I say you goodbye, and if you need any help, you must talk me about this. Goodbye.